Bienvenidas, bienvenidos. The area that we know as Los Angeles has been inhabited for thousands of years. We're going to talk about the history of the area that we now know as Los Angeles. But first, this is Latina Literati. If you enjoy amazing stories, wonderful people from past and present, and great books, then this is the channel for you. For thousands of years, the Hokan-speaking people inhabited the area that is now known as Los Angeles. They hunted sea mammals, they fished in the plentiful rivers, they foraged, they looked after the deer and the other animals that would come down from the different mountain ranges. And so for thousands of years, we know that the Hokan people lived in the area. Eventually, they were replaced by an Uto Aztecan-speaking people, and they called the area Ya. And so the name that has come down to us, the first name of the area that is now Los Angeles, was Ya. And these people also hunted and gathered and fished. They hunted sea mammals and all sorts of animals because it was a completely forested area. If you can imagine the Los Angeles basin as forested, but it was. The Uto-Aztecan people were called Tongva, and the Tongva people were a thriving community made up of many villages. We know that by about the 1700s, about 300,000 native Californians lived throughout the state, and about 5,000 lived in the area that we now call Los Angeles. They lived and fished along what we call the Los Angeles and San Gabriel rivers, and also the Channel Islands. Interesting, they were also part of a very elaborate, very sophisticated trade route. And the trade route included the Chumash, they included the San Luiseño, they included groups all around them. And it went as far as the Colorado River and as south as what we now call Mexico. So very elaborate trade, also intermarriage, very interesting to see the Tongva people who lived in what we now know as the Los Angeles area. The first record of the Tongva people is by the first Europeans who arrived in about 1542. You have the Portola expedition in about 1609, documenting the existence of flourishing villages. And of course, eventually, when the first Mexican settlers, they called it New Spain, then it was not called Mexico, it was called New Spain. When the first settlers arrived, they completely depended on the Tongva flourishing villages to provide them with labor, to provide them with sustenance. They would buy food and pottery and baskets and all the things that the Tongva people were well known for, all of the beautiful things that were needed in the day-to-day existence of the new settlers that they hadn't brought with them. So again, fascinating that the first settlers come north, they arrive north from New Spain, or what is now Mexico, and completely dependent on the Tongva people. Not unlike what would happen 200 years later in the East Coast, completely dependent on the indigenous people for survival, who then, of course, are murdered. But that's another story. We'll stick with the Los Angeles basin for today. So in 1787, you have the first settlers, or pobladores, as they were known, arriving from New Spain, what is now called Mexico, the area called Sonora. And you have to remember that California was two parts. Alta California, which is more or less from San Diego north, and Baja California, which is more or less from San Diego all the way down to La Paz. So they were called Las Californias. There were two halves of the same place. And when the first pobladores arrive, they are quarantined because they want to ensure that they don't have smallpox. because what was already here were, of course, the missions. You had the missions because they're from the 1700s, and you have the presidios. You have military outposts. So you have the missions and you have the presidios, and the governor of California wants to counter the influence and the power of the church and the missions. And so he asks for pobladores or settlers to establish the civic center of Nuestra Señora de los Ángeles, and we'll get into the name in a minute, and Santa Barbara. So you have these pobladores or settlers arrive, they're quarantined, and then they begin to settle as was mandated. It's not that you can just settle any way you want. It was actually kind of a military grid where you had the plaza in the middle. So you have the civil authority, the spiritual authority, and you have, depending on your importance, the houses closest to the plaza are going to be the families of more prestige. So 44 poblados arrive from Sonora, Mexico. And the interesting thing here is that about half were of African descent. So although they came from Mexico, they were documented of African descent. So I don't think most people know that Los Angeles was actually established by Afro-Mexicans. And I think this is really important. And so that's an interesting fact that most people do not know. So the name of the civic municipality or town that was authorized was Nuestra Señora de los Ángeles de Porciúncula. And Porciúncula means a small piece of land. And so everyone was given a little bit of land in order to build their homes. But the interesting thing is that this name is actually from Umbria, in Tuscany, near Tuscany in Italy. Umbria is where the Franciscans were established. And so as a nod to them, this civic entity is named for the place where the Franciscans first were established. So by 1800, the plaza is established. People are farming, and 29 buildings surround the plaza. Pretty interesting that in about 25 years, all of this occurs. And most of it really has to do with the labor of the indigenous people, because we know that it was the indigenous people who were the day laborers who built the buildings for the pobladores or the settlers who arrived from Sonora, Mexico. And Los Angeles would become the largest farming community in the entire state of Alta California. So you had huge farms, and we all remember, or at least have heard of, the huge citrus groves and the other farming activities that occurred all over the basin. And of course, what happens with many times with farming is that the forests are cut down. You also have the abuse of the indigenous people, and so new laws were being also put in place to give them some rights so that they would neither be slaves at the mission nor be taken advantage of by the unscrupulous people that were coming into the area to try and settle and make some profit. It's interesting that as early as 1784, you have the first documented intermarriages between settlers and indigenous women. And so you begin what we all know happens when all sorts of people come together. You fall in love and you get married and you start families. So from the very beginning, California was a place where intermarriage was par for the course, where there was just an amalgamation of different cultures, a blending of all sorts of different groups. Very different than the East Coast, where that was simply really unheard of. You just had a complete separation. But again, that's a separate issue. It's really important because this is very different in California, that once you were registered as man and wife, it didn't really matter what your background was. You were officially married and your children were part of the community, and it didn't matter whether they were indigenous or Mexican or anything else. So you can imagine the floodplain of Los Angeles, just forested, full of willows and oaks, and of course deer and black bear and even some grizzlies. It was really a thriving forested area that was sufficient to have all of these Tongva villages flourishing around it. Of course, as I mentioned, in come the pobladores or settlers. They start chopping down the forests. And of course, with that, all of the wildlife start to leave, because when you take away their habitat, you no longer have the animals to hunt. But you have other domesticated animals being introduced. So you have cattle, and you have horses, and you have donkeys, and other domesticated animals like sheep and pigs that are being introduced and are being raised for the food of the pobladores. And of course, the indigenous people would also eat these new species that before had not been part of their diet. So truly, California has been, from its beginning, the land of abundance. Some people think the name California comes from the old Persian word Califam, which means something like place of mountains. Others say that it's from what they call the Song of Roland from about the 8th century. And because there is a mention in the Chanson de Roland about a califerne, which is, they think, simply a place of the Caliph, a place where there is a prince. But I think, in all probability, most likely the second explanation makes more sense, that it was somehow mentioned in the Chanson de Roland and picked up by a very famous story that was going around in the 1500s. And I'm going to tell you just a little bit about it. So the 16th century romance novel from Spain called Adventures in Esplandian took place in this magnificent land of plenty ruled by a black queen, Califia, and also Amazon women, all black Amazon women. So really interesting that you have these romance novel, maybe pseudo-fantasy, that was absolutely at the what would be equivalent to the top of the charts. It was being read by everyone, and everyone knew when this state is called California that it came from that image of the land of plenty, of this island where these women had this land of plenty. So very interesting. And here are just some images of the queen of the Amazons of the island that you can find in murals throughout different parts of California. So really, really very beautiful. And now for my favorite part of the video, the book recommendations. Really interesting. I tried to look at books to recommend that had to do with this part of California history, and so I hope that you will enjoy them. Always check your library, your local bookseller. We loved our libraries. We love to support our local booksellers, our local small businesses. If perchance you can't find them there, they're not available to you, we always leave links in the description box below if you choose to go ahead and purchase them, new or used, from independent booksellers online. The first book recommendation is called Bound for Freedom. And Bound for Freedom is a book about how people of African descent moved to California to look for opportunity in the 1800s and help settle and build Los Angeles. So a great book. The second book is called Colonial Intimacies by Sylvia Perez. Interesting. It's part of a whole series of books that talks about intermarriage and the relations between all the different groups that occur in early California. Highly recommend it. Think it's fascinating that we are all each other, basically. Really interesting book. The last book that I'm going to recommend is called The Daughters of Califia. And it's a fantasy novel, if you enjoy that sort of thing, sci-fi, but it does talk about this Amazon Black Queen and her island and the land of plenty and an adventure that occurs when strangers appear bearing gifts. And so I thought this was a fabulous way to kind of delve a little deeper into who Califia might have been, at least in the fantasy sci-fi world. This is just one of her stories. So thank you so much for joining us on this joint journey, coming to the end of the video. We love to hear from you. And this video is actually the second one in a series where we take your suggestions. One of the members of our community said, tell us more about the Afro-Mexicans that settled Los Angeles. And so we love to do that. We love to hear from you. So thank you so much for this suggestion. And it was great to study about it and read about it. And I thoroughly enjoyed preparing this information for you. So I hope that you've enjoyed it. We would love you to subscribe to Latina Literati if you haven't already. We're getting very close to 1,000 subscribers, so we'd love to have that. And we would love you to comment. Let us know, what did you think of this content and what would you like us to talk about in the future? Thank you so much again. Mucho cariño, mucho salud y mucho amor siempre. Gracias.